Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia, either in person or online, for tonight's meaningful event, the first installment in 2022 of the Satell Family Foundation Diplochat series. The World Affairs Council is exceptionally good at two things. First, educating middle and high school students about global perspectives and cross-cultural skills in a nonpartisan way. And second, providing great adult educational opportunities to meet, hear, and to personally question leading government officials in the United States and other countries in the news. My name is Ed Satell, and I have had the pleasure of being involved with the Council as a supporter and as a board member for more than 25 years. In all those years, what I have found to be most unique and most valuable about the Council events is the real educational access these programs provide to Philadelphians and guests from other parts of the country, so that thought leaders, policymakers, and tonight diplomats who help shape our world, that access to hear and question is vital for an informed citizenry and has never been more important or impactful than now. That is why I'm thrilled this series presenting outstanding and international diplomats to Philadelphia is named for the Satell Family Foundation. And I'm delighted to give a brief introduction to tonight's guest. The Honorable Nick Greiner currently serves as the Consul-General of Australia in New York. Prior to that, Mr. Greiner was the Premier and Treasurer of the new state Wales, Australia's largest state, from 1988 to 1992, was the Federal President of the Liberal Party of Australia from 2017 to 2020. He also held the positions of Minister for Ethnic Affairs and Minister for Aboriginal Affairs. Mr. Greiner, thank you so much for being with us this evening. And with that, I will turn it over to my good friend, Council President and CEO, Lauren Schwartz.
A virtual thank you to Ed. Ed Satell has been a longstanding friend and board member, supporter, and cheerleader of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. And we're so grateful to the Satell Family Foundation's support for this year-long series called Diplochat, where, as you can tell in the funny title, we're bringing diplomats to Philadelphia from all over the world to have a discussion, to have a chat about what's really going on, where you, as regular people, business leaders, civic leaders, students of all ages can come and ask the questions that are on your mind about what's going on in our world. I'd like to welcome you all to the World Affairs Council's home venue here in Philadelphia, as well as all of our guests joining from around the country online. For those of you who are new to the World Affairs Council, we are a World Affairs and International Affairs experience provider with over 70 years of expertise in connecting Philadelphia to the world. We do speaker programs like this about 30 times a year of all sizes and scale on all topics and always nonpartisan. We provide world affairs education in 85 schools, bringing international affairs into the classroom for 2,500 students so that they can grow up and understand the world around them. We focus on creating civil discourse in a nonpartisan way. We don't have to agree, and we'll never tell you what to think. We'll just help you think about the world around us. A few things in terms of housekeeping. So we do have a hybrid format, people in the room and online. That means when it gets time for question and answer, when you are here in the room and you'd like to ask a question, raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone over to you. That will allow our guests who are joining us virtually to hear your question. For our guests who are joining us remotely from their homes or offices or cars or airports or wherever you may be, please use the Zoom Q&A feature to type in your questions and we'll take those simultaneously with live questions. The format of our program is quite simple. We'll do opening remarks from the Consul General for about 15 minutes, and then we'll move straight into a discussion. The floor is yours. Of course, I've got my stack of questions here, but I'm sure they're not quite as good as what you all have come prepared with tonight. So please don't be shy and help us spark a good conversation. We do have some students in the room tonight, and as is our tradition, we give them the floor first to ask the first question. And I can tell you the students always ask the hardest questions, so it's downhill from there, Nick. We are on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and all of those things. If you'd like to share your experience tonight or photographs, you can use our hashtags WACPHL or WAC Diplochat. And you can access tonight's digital program book by scanning the QR codes that are placed all around the room or on our event page, which is on our website. We'd like to ask everyone to help us keep our events safe so we can continue to do things as we're continuing to be in this pandemic. We ask you to wear your masks as often as possible so we can continue to be safe and hold in-person events. Those are all of my opening comments. I'll get to the main event now. Consul-General Greiner, you were beautifully introduced by our patron and friend Ed Satell. I'll invite you up to the stage to give opening remarks, and then we'll move to Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. Haley, who's been doing a lot of the legwork to get me here on time. And everyone, my friends in Philadelphia, especially Peter Longstreth, who I have to say is responsible for my awareness or knowledge of Philadelphia, such as it is, which is fairly minimal. I was chatting to Ram earlier, and he said he'd been talking to a lady who was involved with me and my government in 1988, as Ed said, or he didn't say, but I was elected premier, which is like governor, in 1988. And apparently this lady who knows me quite well said I was a very good businessman who became an accidental premier. And I thought to myself, well, I think that's probably right, or it's certainly what many people think. I think even more of my friends and supporters would say, well, if I was an accidental premier, I'm an even more accidental diplomat. In fact, when my appointment was announced or leaked, as these things happen to be, I think there was great amazement, including amongst my children and grandchildren, who did not seem to think that diplomacy was anywhere near the top of my list of achievements. And that's probably right. But so I will try and give you a reasonably diplomatic, but not too diplomatic view of the subject matter that Lauren asked me to speak about. I mean, broadly, the subject, I think it was up here at some stage on the screen, is the Indo-Pacific, it's Australia, the US, necessarily China. So I'm going to talk broadly about the relationship between Australia and the US, the way it's developed, where it is today, particularly the AUKUS agreement and the RAA agreement with Japan, which perhaps you won't be quite so familiar with. And I'm going to do all that in 15 minutes because there's a well-placed clock up there. But let me just quickly, and I think it's important because I don't kid myself that you're all experts on Australia and Australia's relationship with the US. I brought a book to present later on, but it's the 70th anniversary of the ANZUS Treaty, which is a treaty signed, not surprisingly, 70 years ago, September last year, which was the main formal agreement between Australia, New Zealand at the time, and the United States. And of course, it grew out of World War II. And that is it's a transformational document for Australia, an existential one perhaps, because Australia relies on that relationship with the United States as its ultimate defense underwriting. And that's a non-partisan position. It's not a position that's substantially challenged anywhere in Australia. So when that book was published, September, our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, said that the ANZUS Treaty was, quote, forged in war, deepened in peace, and held in place by shared ideals. And I think that is not just sort of the usual flowery political rhetoric. I think that is pretty accurate. And I think it is fair to say that if you take all the relationships that a country has, the Australia-US relationship, certainly from an Australian perspective, is very, very special indeed. And I'll come to AUKUS in a few minutes. But the other very special relationship we have is obviously with the United Kingdom, because that was the home country. That was, we didn't quite have to fight to get rid of them the way you did, but obviously we're still part of the British Commonwealth, and Her Majesty is still the Queen of Australia, although that is a contested political issue as to whether that's the appropriate governance arrangement. Now the relationship, and I won't, deal with it for too long, has been going really all through the 19th and 20th centuries, and of course now this century. In 1908, which happened to be the year my father, who's long since passed away, was born in Hungary, President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, sent what was called the Great White Fleet to Australia. And in a sense, that's been, that was a symbolic only exercise, but it was really very, very important. Australia then was only 8 years old as a nation. In the First World War, Australian troops and American troops fought together, especially at the Battle of Hamel, which was in 1918, near the end of the war. There was a very prominent, probably Australia's greatest, perhaps greatest Australian period, John Monash, after whom one of the rooms at the consulate where Matilda and I work in New York is named. And John Monash actually was the commanding officer at the Battle of Hamel, and included commanding American soldiers as well as Brits and other Europeans. So you go from the First World War. In the Second World War, you saved our bacon. I'm not sure saving your bacon is an expression that you use in the United States, but in the Second World War, I think it is fair to say that you saved us. In fact, the Australian-American Leadership Dialogue was started on New Year's Day of 1992 at an event in Sydney Harbour, and President Bush, the first one, was there as a guest. And he made the point that he thought he would be the last ever American president who had fought in the Pacific. And he was making the general point that he thought it was both important that Australia and the US work at their relationship, and particularly that they do so, and that comes to sort of the real part of tonight, that they do so in the context of Asia and Asia Pacific, and how important that area of the world would be. And he was, say, talking 30 years ago, but he was making the correct point that he thought it would take extra effort when there were no more American leaders who had actually fought in the Pacific and fought with Australians. Perhaps only a couple of other background things to say. The Australian-American Association, which is still the leading Australian-American organisation, was founded in 1948, just after the war. Keith Murdoch, who was the father of Rupert Murdoch of News Limited fame, I guess, he was the first president, and ever since 1948, there has been a very strong business relationship. In the historical context, we've fought with the United States in Korea, in Vietnam, in the Middle East, in Afghanistan. We've been members of all the coalitions of the willing. As Sir Robert Menzies, who was our greatest Prime Minister and longest serving, he said, and it's a bit like what Prime Minister Morrison said in there, we've been warmed by the same inner fires. Put in a rather more colloquial way, when LBJ came to Australia during the Vietnam War, our then Prime Minister said, "You can be sure, President, that we are all the way with LBJ." And that's gone down in Australian history. But at the same visit, there were protesters. It was the time of the Vietnam War, and some of the protesters had lain down on the road in front of the cars. And one of my predecessors as Premier of New South Wales, and I have to say he was from the same side of politics, the sort of centre-right, he famously said to the police, "Just run over the bastards." Oh, we didn't run over the bastards, but there is no doubt where the historical base of our support lies, and that's as much as I want to say about the historical context. I think it's fair to say that in more recent years, during the Cold War, the Asia-Pacific was a bit of a diversion. It really wasn't where the focus of most people interested in geopolitics was. And indeed, it's fair to say that while it has shifted, which is why we're here tonight, doesn't take much for issues in Ukraine or other places to the more traditional, if you like, Cold War sorts of tensions to flare up, and to make it important, at least from an Australian perspective, but I think from a world perspective, that the Asia-Pacific region not be forgotten about. The final thing I want to say about the history is under President Obama, there was talk of a pivot to Asia. President Obama visited Australia. More Marines were and still are sent to Australia. More exercises are held. There is greater interoperability between the American and Australian forces. But it's fair to say that the pivot in the Obama years was seen as important, but not overwhelming in its significance. So let me come to today. The alliance architecture into which AUKUS, which is really what Lauren asked me to talk about, fits, is really quite extensive. There's been, ever since Second World War, now 75 or more years, there's been the Five Eyes, the US, Canada, Australia, the UK, New Zealand, which is an intelligence sharing network and is continues to be very strong indeed. There's occasional suggestions that Japan and Korea, India should be added to that intelligence network, and that's above my pay grade. But it's fair to say that at least as far as intelligence sharing goes, there is a very strong, long-standing link between the Five Eyes and very good relationships with other like-minded countries. The more recent organisation that you'll hear about, and it's on, I think Mr. Blinken is in Australia, he might just have left, the Quad. The Quad is the US, Canada, is the US, Australia, Japan and India. And that's an interesting, and you don't need to be too interested in all this to think, that's an interesting Quad, those four countries, Japan, India, Australia and the US. It's one that President Biden hosted a Quad meeting in September in Washington. It's not a formal organization. It's been around since almost about 15, 16 years, but it is now it's now creating far more interest, far more focus in each of the four countries because it is an organization that is clearly placed in the Indo-Pacific. Excuse me. We've also got in more recent days, I'll come back to AUKUS, the Japan-Australia Reciprocal Access Agreement. Japan and Australia, obviously, we thought in the 1940s they were going to take over. They got to into Sydney Harbour. Some of you have been. They had a little submarine in Sydney Harbour. There was a great deal of concern about all the battles in the Pacific, which were essentially where the US helped Australia, which would not have been capable of protecting itself. So we've now got, and we have remained, despite that sort of wartime background, we've remained very, very close to Japan. They helped Australia in from the 1950s onwards, so only 10 or so years from the end of the war. They were our #1 customer, mostly for our mineral products. And it's fair to say that the relationship's always been strong. The Japan-Australia reciprocal access is what it says. It's about economic ties. It's about economic security, things like supply chains and cybersecurity, things that everyone is interested in at the moment. And ultimately, it's about a free and open Indo-Pacific, which is the core thesis, if you like, of Australia and indeed of the United States. In September last year, out of the blue, I think almost no one predicted it, no one had written about it, no journalist had discovered it. There was also the announcement of the AUKUS agreement, which I'll talk about, although I'm getting close to my 15 minutes. But my point is simply that there's been a process of evolution. There's been ups and downs in the Australia-United States relationship, but generally it's been very strong. And it's also self-evident that over the last 5 or so years, the changing attitude of China to geopolitics, their attitude to a whole lot of issues, which I'm happy to answer questions about, which go to security in the area, which go to their economic coercion or attempts at it vis-a-vis Australia and now vis-a-vis other countries. The change in the last better part of 5 years has really dramatically changed the context within which I think every country in the Pacific looks at what it's doing in terms of security. Well, I think that's as much as I want to say in terms of that's today. What's the future? And I'd like to talk a little about AUKUS, which I think was, as I say, the incentive or the initiative for my being asked to be here. AUKUS, Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States, is essentially a technology sharing agreement. And I thought it shows I'm becoming a diplomat. I'm going to read you only one paragraph of what our ambassador said on the subject, because I should probably not get this wrong, although I will, as soon as I've read this, get it wrong. But what Arthur Sinodina said very recently was, look, the aspiration we have, and I believe Americans have, and other like-minded countries, the sort of countries that stand up to the values we believe in, it's to have a global rules-based order that applies to all countries, big and small, and that our aspiration is for China to be very much part of that order. The actions that were taken, for example, accession of China to the WTO, the World Trade Organization, were all part of a strategy of bringing China in. But as China has risen and the center of gravity of the global economy, the global geopolity, has become China, as that center has shifted to the Indo-Pacific, that's raised real challenges as strategic circumstances have changed. When we, that's Australia, did our white paper on defence in 2016, we looked out and we saw the way in which our geostrategic circumstances were changing. But those trends that we saw then have accelerated. So last year we did a defence strategic update to take account of that. In doing that, we committed ourselves to raising our defence spending further. We committed ourselves to getting new capabilities. We, in fact, I think, committed at that stage to something like an extra $270 billion in capability spending over the next decade. At the moment, our defence spending is trending towards 2.5% of GPT. That's the end of the quote from which is an attempt to summarize the background to AUKUS. Why did AUKUS happen? As you will know, the Australian government, as part of AUKUS, was given access to technology to build nuclear-propelled, not nuclear-armed, but nuclear-propelled submarines. And the US and the UK. The UK is the only country with which the US has ever shared this technology, and that was about the time I was born. That's quite a long while ago. So it's been talked about as though it's about submarines. Look, it is about submarines to the extent that we cancelled our contract with the French, and I'll say a word or two non-diplomatically about that in a minute. We cancelled our contract with the French, and we are in the process of sorting out over the next 12 months exactly where and how these submarines will be made. It's a question of how quickly they can be made because they have long lead times. But so that is in the process of being sorted out. But it isn't simply about submarines. It is effectively a capability enhancement agreement. And so all the things that you read about all the time, artificial intelligence, cyber security, technology sharing right across the board, are an integral part of what AUKUS is about. And it's very important, of course, for Australia that the US and the UK honour the commitment of the political leaders. It hasn't always been unusual that political leaders say one thing and defence leaders don't always quite go along with it. Defence leaders tend to have different views sometimes. So that's what AUKUS is, and it's in the process of being sorted out. Let me, to show I'm not too diplomatic, say a bit about China and France. The French were unhappy. Our contract was with a French government-owned enterprise, and it I think initially was 50 billion. It was going to eventually be 90 billion, and not surprisingly, they were unhappy when the government changed its view. Australia and France are very, very close. France is very important in the Pacific. Many of you will know there's a large number of French dependencies in the Pacific, and it's very much our hope and expectation that whilst they won't immediately forget the slight that they understandably feel, that France will continue to play a really important part in the Asia Pacific because they've been there forever, as it were. The Chinese government said this was a really bad idea. AUKUS, it was going to accelerate a lack of stability in the Indo-Pacific. I was reminded when I heard that of, I don't know how many, some of you are as old as I am, the Profumo affair in the United Kingdom back in the 60s was about the defense minister at the time who'd been sleeping with a couple of prostitutes. And he, of course, denied that this had happened when it became public. And one of the younger of the two prostitutes was an 18-year-old girl called Mandy Rice-Davies. And the journalists came up to her and they said, Miss Rice-Davies, Mr. Profumo has denied that he slept with you. And she looked up at the journalists and she said, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? Well, that's essentially what you would expect the Chinese to say. I mean, I don't think it's a meaningful exercise for me to give you the long list of what China claims are the slights we have inflicted on them. They did release 14 things that we had done, which started from we were the first country to call for an inquiry into the origins of COVID. That does not feel like a totally courageous thing to have asked for. In fact, it feels very much like common sense, I would have thought. But anyway, there are 14 things that they indicated were things Australia had done which they didn't like, and they also didn't like AUKUS because they said it was a cause of instability. Clearly, Australia's perspective is that there is instability, and it's essentially caused by a whole range of different approaches that we can talk about if there's interest. I think the only other thing I would say is that the other countries in the Pacific are all looking at this in a very interested way. I think India, which has a complex relationship with China for all sorts of reasons, given the border and so on, I think it's, they've been officially supportive, but they're worried about their relationship with China, as indeed you would expect them to be. So I think that's a complex thing that really will require time to sort itself out. And the other major countries, Vietnam, South Korea, Indonesia, I think have all understood and have said publicly that they understood why the US, the UK and Australia were doing this, but they were concerned that it not lead to a nuclear proliferation, which we certainly agree with. And they were concerned that it not contribute unnecessarily to instability. Well, that's fine. Our view, of course, is that redressing some of the balance, the defense balance in the Indo-Pacific actually will contribute to stability rather than reduce it. I think, Lauren, that's probably as much as I want to say by way of introductory remarks, but someone said to me the other day, Australia's getting more publicity in the United States than it used to, and maybe more than it wants. Well, we don't usually get much publicity. We're normally happy about that. But in the case of AUKUS, we think it is an exceptionally important agreement, not just for ourselves as a middle power, 25 million people in the middle of the South Pacific. We think it is very important for the future of that whole region, which I think will be, at the end of the day, where most of the geopolitics of the 21st century are worked out. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Nick. It's quite impressive. You definitely have gone to diplomacy school to pack all of that into about 15 minutes. Now we'll move into audience questions and answers. I can tell by the looks on your faces, many of you have things on your mind and things you'd like to ask Nick to dive a little bit more deeply. As is our tradition here, we start with a question from our students in the audience. We've got Alex Crespo. She's a junior and international relations major at St. Joe's here in Philadelphia. She's also serving as a mentor to middle school students who will compete in our junior model UN. Alex is one of the future leaders who will help solve some of these complex issues. Alex, there's a microphone behind you.
Thank you, Consul General, for your time. My question is, what are the deeper implications of AUKUS's development of nuclear submarines in Australia in terms of aggravating already heightened tensions between China and allied nations?
Well, it's a good question. I guess I've tried to address it a bit, Alex, in my remarks. The deeper implications are that on the one hand, the alliance of the people with support for the sort of world that Arthur's quote referred to, liberal democratic societies, they think it is an obvious extension of the ties between the three countries, UK, US, and Australia. And it does help significantly, or it will. Now, let me be non-diplomatic, and maybe this is an answer to your question. When the French were unhappy, as they should have been, as you'd expect them to be, I think one of the French, maybe he was the foreign minister, he said to the journalists, he said, AUKUS, it's just a plan for a plan. And that's, I don't think that's an unfair, I mean, he was trying to say this in a critical way. It is true. When Mr. Biden, Mr. Johnson, and Mr. Morrison announced it, they said, look, we're going to spend 18 months working out in detail, especially the submarine part of it. It means that the balance of capability in a military sense in the Indo-Pacific will have changed slightly towards the US and Australia and the UK and the other countries of a similar intent. I don't think, I'm reminded of John Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, who again, some of the older people will remember as an economist. He once said, when circumstances change, I change my mind with the circumstances. That's all that's happening here. Circumstances have changed. And it's not a matter of trying to say, well, it's all the fault of the Chinese, and that's all the fault of Australia. I think that's an unnecessary, you can have obvious views about that. I think all that's happened with AUKUS is if it is effectively implemented, which is still a question. I mean, at the moment, it is a plan for a plan. If it's effectively implemented, which I expect that it will be, because it's important for the US and the UK, and they wouldn't have signed up to it in such a public way if they weren't committed to it. But if it's properly implemented, it will certainly mean that there are the effective forces by 10, 15 years from now in the Indo-Pacific will have a slightly different balance, and a balance that is more favorable, more protective of Australia and the countries that support it. I think there is no more detailed or no more nuanced way to address it. It is perfectly obvious why it's happened, and it's common sense that the attitudes of the major country in the region have changed, their behaviour has changed, and so the behaviour of other countries changes. I don't think it's more complex than that.
Thank you. Our next question is from Owen, also a student at St. Joe's and also mentoring the young folks competing in Junior Model UN. Owen?
Pleasure again, Consul General. So if a conflict does erupt on the Ukrainian border, what steps, if any, has AUKUS in the process of the Indo-Pacific region taken to ensure China doesn't invade Taiwan in the process?
I think that falls into, I'm sorry, I missed your name. Owen. I think, Owen, that falls classically into a question that I don't have an answer to. Secondly, if I did have an answer, I wouldn't tell you. And thirdly, if I did tell you, someone would probably kill me. But I don't mean to make, it's clearly a difficult world situation. I don't mean to make light of it. It has obviously, I've seen, while watching the Winter Olympics, I've seen Mr. Putin and President Xi announcing, but they're also lifting their alliance. You can't blame them. It seems to me like an obvious thing to do. I think the alliances, and from the time President Biden, or even during the election when he ran against Mr. Trump, and clearly his view of the way the United States was to behave in the world was to strengthen, rebuild relationships, which he was arguing, I think probably correctly, President Trump had chosen to allow to lapse or to have less significance. So we're obviously interested in Taiwan. It's very much in our neck of the woods. The South China Sea is very much where a lot of our trade goes. So it's a very important question for us, whereas Ukraine obviously is geographically a little different. What the alliance, the allies, if you want to call them that, are doing is to build up the disincentives for either China or the US, Russia, to take military action. I mean, that's what's happening. That's why the British, the Dutch, the whatevers, the United States have all sent troops and resources towards the Ukraine. It is a matter of making it obvious that an attack on the Ukraine will have implications that are much broader than the takeover of Crimea had, when essentially nothing happened when the Russians chose to take it over. And the same applies, exactly the same applies with respect to Taiwan, that the purpose is to create as many disincentives for aggressive action against Taiwan as is possible. And again, the pretty much the same countries, but with a different balance, because the European countries, the NATO countries are interested in the Ukraine, countries in Asia obviously interested in Taiwan. So I understand the point that you might use the cover of something happening in the Ukraine to also do something in Taiwan. It's above my pay grade as to what happens then, but I do think it's occurred to the United States and countries that have a general sympathy with it. But their response is essentially one of lifting the price for the countries that may choose to take aggressive action.
Good question, Owen. You struck a nerve. That's the point. All right. Any other questions from the audience here? All right, Sam. And Christy will bring you a microphone.
Consul General, thank you very much. My name is Sam Waltz. I'm from Greenville, Wilmington, Delaware. I appreciate the reference that there may be people in the room who are your generational peers. The cornerstone of foreign policy, such as American-Australian partnership, is based on alignment of geopolitical interests, and we often treat that as a 500-pound gorilla. But oftentimes there are cultural and contextual things that can impact that. And many in the room are young enough that they don't even have this chapter in their book that I'm going to ask you about. But you, in your remarks, a couple of times referenced Vietnam. And Vietnam was, of course, a compelling story of our dark-haired youth. And the thing that I recall about Australia and America during the Vietnam War, roughly 1960 to 1975, is that Australia, for tens, hundreds of thousands, and maybe millions of young GIs, was the equivalent of the spring break destination on R&R. It was that fueled of alcohol, beverages, adrenaline, and maybe other substances for the equivalent of that spring break experience. And I have to want, and for millions of young American GIs who were in their 18, 20, 22, 24, that probably shaped their experience of Australia. And I was in the Army at the time. I was in Army counterintelligence, and the Army brought me from Illinois to Philadelphia. So I was not part of that. I served here. But I'm curious what legacy you might feel exists today as a result of that experience, where Australia was so much the R&R spring break type destination for all of these young men getting a break from wartime.
You do get difficult questions here, don't you? I'm tempted to say that the one obvious implication was that there are now a lot of Australian women who are living in the United States, or did live in the United States if they're older. But look, I think it is each of those wars, and I mean, you sort of in a gentle way describe the fact that the Australians may have contributed to the drinking habits. I'm not sure we could outdrink the American GIs, but we are very similar. I mean, those various quotes there in this book, they're all various attempts by political leaders to say in a more political way what you are saying in a more human way, that the relationship between the two countries and their two armed forces, and Vietnam was the biggest. It was where most Australians died, of course, not counting the World War II. And I think on a per capita basis, we were very high up in terms of the sacrifice that young Australians made. So it wasn't just the R&R when the guys came to Sydney, and they did come, and they did have a good time, and they did have the good sense to marry Australian girls. Many of them did. So I think the relationship is, I can't contemplate another country, frankly, which, even though you got Canada, obviously close, so I think the attitudes, especially of the soldiers in all of those wars, certainly back to the First World War in the trenches in France, in the Pacific in the Second World War, and in Vietnam, and to a degree in Korea, we've always seemed to get along particularly well. And it's a human thing as well as an interests. And yeah, people like me talk about liberal values, and that's all correct and important. But I think it is a very human relationship. And I think the quality of that human relationship is forged in many ways in situations like Vietnam.
When you were mentioning having fun in Australia, there were a number of people in the room who studied abroad in Australia who had a chuckle during that question, Sam. We've got a few questions coming in from online. I won't name any names. If you keep giggling, they'll know who you are. All right. David from our online audience asks us to, he asks you to discuss the green efforts in Australia, particularly the large reliance on coal. Can you speak to climate mitigation efforts?
Yeah, sure. Look, I'll be a lot less diplomatic about that. Look, it's, I do think the argument about the science, if you like, I think is well and truly over. It's well and truly over in Australia. It's well and truly over in most places, including areas, countries that have significant mining industries. What that question refers to is that Australia has, I think, the largest export of coal in the world. And it has the highest quality coal in the world, if you like, the less polluting, not that it's not polluting, but it's very high quality. The notion that any government in the world is about to accelerate the demise of its second largest export industry that employs, I think directly, don't hold me to the numbers, it might be of the order of 50,000 people directly and a multiple of that indirectly. And an industry which is politically pretty much in a position to decide the government of the country. The notion that any country in the world, Poland's the good example of a similar European country. God gave us a lot of coal. It is being bought by China, by India, we're using less of it. Our coal-fired power stations are going to be put out of business by their owners. In fact, only today, AGL, which is the owner of two very large coal-fired power stations, announced it was going to accelerate their demise in my state, in New South Wales. So Australia's committed to, has now joined almost every country in terms of the net zero by 2050 commitment. Anyone really interested in this ought to read an article in, not sure which of the many American papers I read. One of the weekend papers looked at Germany's experience when it decided to close its coal industry, to close its nuclear industry, and move more rapidly towards renewables. And it has been, if I could use an Australian adjective, it's been bloody hard for Germany, which is a very capable country, and Mrs. Merkel, very strong leader who made some of those decisions. So the science is not an argument anymore. The technology, I mean, what we have said, what the government's position is that we think the answer is in technology. We don't think it's in tax. And they've clearly indicated that they're not about in some massive way to, it'd be the equivalent of closing West Virginia many times over in terms of the scale and the importance of the coal industry. But we are very much at the forefront of the moves towards green hydrogen. We are have got it's going to sound like a politician, not like a diplomat. There is a 5-point plan. Politicians always have 5-point plans. There is a 5-point plan of a technology roadmap, which I think everyone agrees is a sensible roadmap. And it's what we're intending to do. But beyond that, I think the domestic coal industry, which was referred to in the question, will go away of its own accord. And then the power plants will come to the end of their useful lives and so on. Internationally, I think it's a matter of what happens to the market. If people are going to continue to want to buy coal, which at the moment they certainly do, if we were suddenly to close our industry, that wouldn't help the world. It would certainly damage us and the people concerned. But so I don't think there's going to be any artificial effort to accelerate the demise of the Australian coal export industry. I do think the domestic industry will decline quite quickly. And I do think Australia, to use another Australianism, is fair dinkum about the net zero 2050, but they're not just going, we're not going to make promises that are simply promises and that which we don't have a meaningful plan to execute on.
John in the back.
You were discussing the importance of relations with Japan and India and how that's like maybe strange bedfellows. I was wondering about your thoughts on Indonesia. I was looking today and there was a big arms sale from the United States to Indonesia, $14 billion and some jets. And I know that Australia has very strong ties with Indonesia as a third largest population, as a Muslim country. Can you discuss the importance of those relationships as it relates to China?
Yeah, look, the Australia-Indonesia relationship is really quite interesting. It is our closest neighbour. At the closest point, I think it's 16 miles, to use your measurement here, from Australia to Indonesia. So we are very close. It is, as Jonathan says, it's 220 million, I think, people. It is the largest Muslim country. It's also a country with, I think, hundreds of thousands of islands with a lot of religious and other differences, fragmentation. It's a difficult country. Every Australian Prime Minister that I can remember, and I can now remember a few, has gone to Indonesia as their first overseas trip, which they don't do just for fun. They do it because it is symbolically important. That said, I think we could probably, I think both sides would agree we could have done better, both in economic and human relations, as I said in answer to the question here about the Vietnam War. Human relations are important. Most Australians' relationship to Indonesia is they go to Bali for a holiday, and they usually are the same age as the people that were being talked about in the Vietnam War, and they also seem to be interested in alcohol and other social activities. I think Indonesia has, and look, this is, I'm not involved, it's not part of my New York Consul-General thing. They clearly have an important place. I think they're clearly interested and concerned in what happens with AUKUS. They don't want there to be instability in the area. I think they can be a source for a great deal of good because of their size. I think they can actually behave and that they do, in a responsible way, which I think contributes to reducing the risk of any serious instability in the Indo-Pacific. So I think they're a very important player. They don't get as much publicity or attention for reasons that I've never quite understood. It's true in Australia as well as here. For the size of the country and its importance strategically and otherwise, you don't read about them as often as perhaps one should, I think. I think that's, Jonathan, as much as I can help with. I think Indonesia, certainly for Australia, look, there's an election in May, and whoever wins, I imagine they will probably do the normal thing and go and see Mr. Widodo as their first port of call. I think that in a sense tells you how important they think Indonesia can be for the Indo-Pacific.
Any other questions from the room? All right, we've got a question in the back here.
Vincent O'Malley. In the recent, now citizen of Philadelphia, formerly of Buffalo, Niagara Falls. In the United States, there seems to be an increasing popularity of socialism. Is that also happening in Australia? What's your history and what's the current?
Well,
thinking?
I have a centre-right political background. I guess I personally was what you would call, older people here would call a Rockefeller Republican or a conservative Democrat, somewhere I was in the middle. Yeah, look, the answer to your question about, we have a Labor Party, which is the centre-left party, and the Liberal Party, not in the same meaning as your sense of the word liberal, which is it's the Republican Party, or right at the moment, I'm not so sure I want it to be, but it's the Conservative Party. So it's the centre-right. Over the history of Australia, the parties, the centre-left and centre-right, have shared government pretty much equally. I think the Conservatives have won slightly more. But I think the real answer to your question is that at the election, which will be held in 3 or 4 months from now, the Labor Party, the centre-left, is not running with an agenda that, leaving the politics aside, I don't think one could reasonably say they're a socialist party. I mean, I follow some of the stuff here about the more aggressive, progressive wing of the Democrats and the more centre wing of the Democrats here. I'd have to say the Labor Party is not as tempted by socialist policies as perhaps some parts of the Democrats are here. The only other thing I'd say is that it is very tempting for politicians when money is free. And I think COVID has had some really good impacts I know it sounds strange, but I think it's had a lot of really good impacts. I won't tell you now what I think they are, but one of the bad impacts, of course, is that governments of all sorts have been given an imprimatur that they can spend as much money as they like because of the difficulty of dealing with the economic impact of the COVID pandemic. So when you say to a politician of whatever colour, interest rates are, call them zero, and politically you can seem to spend as much money as anyone's ever spent, and you don't tend to get into a lot of trouble because, the reason you're doing it is you've got businesses closing down and unemployment and all the impact of COVID in 2020. So it is a really unusual time. And it's a bit of a danger, I think, that it's very tempting for politicians, not just in the United States, but in all of the Western countries, all of the democratic first world countries, very tempting. When the cost of money is zero and the political pain of spending it doesn't seem to be as great as it might be in other circumstances. So no, we are not as tempted by socialism as perhaps other countries, but I do understand why political leaders are tempted in the current circumstance.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming tonight. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I have a whole slew of questions about COVID and Afghanistan, which lucky for you, we didn't quite reach. I hope you all enjoyed our program and appreciate the access we're able to provide to, this is our kind of influencer, right? To folks like Nick who come to Philadelphia. You've been here many times and we look forward to welcoming you back many times more. Thank you for joining us tonight. We've got some more events like this coming up on March 2nd. We'll have a discussion on Japan-US defense collaboration, followed by a sushi and sake tasting in Conshohocken. Fine. Then we're coming back to Philadelphia on April 5th. We got to spread the love around, right? We'll have a council conversation club, which is a discussion group, a different format, supported by the Stan and Arlene Ginsberg Family Foundation. And we'll be discussing, should museums return artifacts to other countries around the world? If that's a topic of interest to you, sign up and join us for a very lively debate. On May 18th, we will host our Consul-General of Mexico as well. And that will also be paired with a culinary and beverage tasting here in Philadelphia, and many more events to come. Thank you to Consul General Greiner for his diplomatic and undiplomatic discussion with us tonight.
Thank you. And can I just say, this is a small gift. You'll find a library or a shelf for it. This is the Alliance at 70. It is by the United States Study Centre in Australia. Some of you have been to Perth. Some of this comes from Perth. This is a small gift from me. And let me say, I'm offended that you're apparently having Mexican food, Japanese food. What happened to the Australian food? It's okay, we have such distinguished things as Vegemite and Wichita grubs. And
I
anyway,
was asked where the
thank you.
Vegemite was.
Thank you.
So
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
it's been our pleasure. Thank you.